jumping on the KMA bandwagon is viewing this from higher ground. I assume all of you have seen the exhibit. I have several times. I'm very impressed with it. One of the things I wondered when I first read about it in an article in the News Center was, what did they mean by higher ground? And maybe Stephen, you can tell us. But I suspect that's one of these really good names that political advisors and advertisers give you. It can mean different things to different people.
You want the answer?
Yeah.
I can't claim credit for it. David Butler came up with it. We liked the sound of it, but it was basically talking about the mountainous terrain as being a source of inspiration for artists through the centuries, and also the early aspirations of artists like Lloyd Branson and Catherine Wiley to use art and the conversations around art to elevate the culture of our region.
And that's pretty much coming at it from a point of view of by training, I'm really a social culturalist. That's pretty much what I assume. My spin on it, because you can interpret it however you want to. This is America, right? There's another way to look at it. Higher ground means that you can see patterns that you can't see when you're on lower. I've just come back. I spent 12 wonderful years in New Mexico, and I've just come back. And one of the things you learn about Navajo culture is Navajos believe nothing is random. Everything has a pattern, but often we can't see it because we're on the ground and we're not up above. And so I'm cribbing the title here because I think I have some perspectives on our region here that I certainly didn't have. I grew up here. I left at age 18. I came back from New Mexico when I was 36, not with any desire to come back. My dad had passed away and I needed to come home and take care of family matters. And so I think I have higher ground now as a scholar, which I'm not suggesting that makes me superior. I'm suggesting it simply allows me to see some things that at least I did not see previously. Now, in your handout it talks about reimagining Appalachia. So I want to do something sort of academic at first. And I want to talk about what we think of when we think of Appalachia. And I've played this game with students at Webb and at UT Ending School and with the Kiwanis and church groups and all. And so I'll just throw out to you Appalachia, and you can tell me what's in your head, and I'm not going to take time to write on the blackboard all these terms. Let me suggest to you, though, that for our purposes today, there's two broad ways of looking at Appalachia. One I would simply call the traditional or the popular view of Appalachia. And if you think of that, and I'm going to use some slides here, you think about it geographically. It is a very, very large region. Certainly politically it is. If you know anything about the Appalachian Regional Commission, that's a good example of politicians working geography at events. But it is a very broad region. The boundaries, though, unlike, say, state boundaries, are very, very elusive. And I'll give you an example for us. Where along I-40, if you're coming from the coast of Carolina, does Appalachia begin? Winston-Salem, Hickory, Morganton, Old Fort, certainly by Asheville. And if you're going west from here, where does it end? Cookville? Carlsville? That's why one of the reasons I use the term elusive, okay? Geographically speaking. Now, obviously when we think of Appalachia and we do word association, we think of cultural things. Whereas geographically the term is elusive and imprecise, traditionally people have known exactly what they were talking about. And it conjures up both positive and negative images. Poor, ignorant, super rural, superstitious, and you can get more juicy, incestuous, or violent, or whatever. On the other hand, there are terms like independent, and rugged, and hardworking, and self-reliant. A word that could go both ways is the word simple. Simple as in Simple Simon, as you're not very smart. Simple as in the Shaker song, "'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free." And so the word has multiple meanings, and but they're very definitive. Now, revisionist views. Most of you at least remember enough either through living through the 60s or studying in history to know that Vietnam, civil rights, the counterculture, tremendous angst in American culture. And it changed the way we look at everything. Take blacks, civil rights, black studies, the rediscovery of black history. Alex Haley is the best popular example. Okay? Well, that affected Chicanos, it affected Native Americans, it affected Appalachians. And so Appalachian studies, the field that I knew nothing about when I came back here. My PhD and my work was in the Southwest, and I loved that. But I came back here and I didn't know about northern New Mexico. So I took on Appalachian. Appalachian studies, first of all, does not help us solve the problem, because you can get a bunch of us people at Appalachian Studies Conference, and we'll argue, where does it begin, where does it end? It's still very, very imprecise, still very elusive. But when you look at the cultural definition of Appalachian, it's a very different point of view. Our traditional view is an Appalachian that is static. And by static, I mean frozen in time. All you got to do is go see Mr. Irwin's Appalachian Museum. He has no house trailers on that side. Right? His is frozen in a, or look at Kate's Cup, a very idyllic, romanticized 19th century, or if you don't want to romanticize living in a cabin, it's pretty primitive, right? It is static. We who study Appalachian studies, and here is the prime example of what I'm talking about. We describe a region that is very dynamic, the opposite of static, very vibrant, very alive. The traditional Appalachia is isolated. People are poor because they're isolated, they're ignorant because they're isolated. We don't think so. Our scholarship says Appalachia, first of all, is very interrelated with the rest of the world. Take the coal industry, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. Very much so. Industrialization of the United States in the 19th century, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, was based on West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee coal. So we're very interrelated. But one of the things that some of us in the last 10 years or so in the field have said, not only are we interrelated and interdependent with the rest of America, but there is diversity within our region. There are people like us in this room who don't fit those stereotypes. And there are people where I take my web kids on service outings up in coal country who fit those stereotypes. And our lives are not just interrelated, but they're intra-related. It gets kind of messy here, okay? And so this Appalachia is dynamic. It is not isolated. It is interrelated and dependent. It is particularly diverse. With my web kids, I'm always trying to figure ways to make things stick in kids' head. And I call these the 3Ds. And I have 2 3Ds. We'll get to the other one later. Diverse, dynamic, and divided. Knoxville sort of battles with the rural areas, and we make fun of rural people. Rural people make fun of city people. And we have been a region often at war with ourselves. That's why I use the word elusive. Are we in this room Appalachian? Again, I'll talk more about this encyclopedia. Now, let's take this to look at East Tennessee. If you look at this map, East Tennessee is a clear sub-region of Appalachia. Okay? The way I got into this is when I started teaching the course at Webb, I didn't know that Webb kids would want to take a course in Appalachian history. And so I thought, well, if I make it a history of Appalachia and East Tennessee, they'll take a greater interest. And that's a good example of a good Appalachian expression that says a blind hog, even a blind hog can find a walnut every now and then. This blind hog found a walnut. Because what I discovered, by the grace of God or accident, depending on which one you prefer, what I discovered is no scholar had looked at East Tennessee using this scholarship. Bruce Wheeler's written the history of Knoxville. He didn't use this scholarship. There's not really been a good overview of East Tennessee history for 50 years. This scholarship is a product of the last 30. So I'm pounding the drum here. I'm the first scholar to look at East Tennessee through this perspective. Okay? Now, when you look at East Tennessee, again, geographically, if you're defining Appalachia by geography, then we're all in this room. I tell my kids, if you live out up in the hills or in Sequoia Hills, you're here. If you're plowing the back in Cock County or you're shopping at West Down Mountain, by geography, we're Appalachia. Now, what I've also found, though, and that's the reason for my book, Appalachians All the Time, is that demographically, having to do with population, culturally, economically, what we already know. East Tennessee is a diverse region. Okay? And that's partly a function of geography. And so I have 3 representative communities. My book looks at 3 communities and tries to knit their story together. Knoxville, which doesn't think it's Appalachian most of the time. Cades Cove, which most of us know, yeah, that's Appalachian. And an area we don't know very much about, but the Clear Fork Valley goes basically from Jellicoe over to Middlesboro. And what I look at is these 3 representative communities. Now, and I'll get to the coal ash field in a second. I would submit to you, and you can tell me later whether I'm right or wrong, most people who live here don't know anything about this new understanding of Appalachia. We scholars, because we talk to ourselves, we write for each other, we have not shared with people like you all. You all are the target audience for my book. I call you all intelligent non-scholars. Okay? And I would argue that very few East Tennesseans, I know that's true, because I didn't know anything about this, and I was smart. And I had a PhD, and I grew up here. I didn't know anything about it. Now, here's my thesis for today's talk. Let me go to the next picture. I would argue that the Kingston TVA coal ash spill of the 22nd of December 2009, and our response to it, our response as residents of this region, reflects, in my mind, the implications of what I'm saying to you, but it also reflects the cost and the consequences of these realities that we do not understand well, that our lives are all interconnected. Okay? For me, with my 3 representative communities, Cades Cove and the coal country up there, you would think it's Appalachia. Not alone, they're not. Knoxville doesn't think it is. But when you put the 3 together and you look at their historical development, what you see is their destinies are intertwined. For better and for worse, and it's always both. History is a messy business. Anybody gives you all black or all white, they're not telling you history, they're telling you myth. Our destinies are very much intertwined. But because we don't understand our own history, we're blind to that. Knowing our history won't solve our problems, but I would argue you can't begin to solve problems if you don't know how you got there. Okay? To me, the sum of the parts are what I mean by a reimagined Appalachia. An Appalachia that has an urban center, and a city, and a university, and television stations, but an Appalachia that has strip mining and has this mess. All right. Now, if we're going to reimagine our region and ourselves, East Tennessee, the first thing we got to do is say, well, if this region is more diverse than we imagine, if it's more dynamic than we imagine, if it's more divided, how did this happen? I'm first and foremost a historian, not just a historian who became an Appalachianist by chance. As a historian, I would tell you that there are 2 constants that always shape history. One is geography, the other is time. And when an event occurs, because that determines whether that event is just an insignificant thing or becomes very big. Okay. Now, if you look at East Tennessee, and you take, whoops, where did I get this? If I go back. Oh, I have another map, but it's the map on the back side of your handout. If you look at the map that I did not scan, and I have to give credit to a historian by the name of Paul Summerson. We're looking at the period roughly, those of you that have some sense of chronology, from the American Revolution to the post-Civil War, the area when all of East Tennessee was settled. Okay? Paul Summerson is an economic historian, and he argues that there are many Appalachians, that Appalachia is diverse. He divides them because of geography and timing into 3 categories. And we have an example of each in my book, and that's not by coincidence. Oldest Appalachia is the place settlers first came. Settlers first came where there was rich soil, where there's access to markets. Okay. In Tennessee, they settled here before they settled Cades Cove, before they settled coal country. Because the soil was richer, the valley was wider, and they hoped the Tennessee River would be accessible. to outside transportation. They were about 150 years too early because it took TVA to make that happen. But still, the valley, the Indians knew, the Indian warrior trails were up and down the valley. Those just like I-40 and I-81. It's easier to build a road in a valley. All right? So you have oldest Appalachia, and in my study, that's Knoxville, Tennessee. Now, if you look at that map, Paul says gradually, here's a big legal term for you. Families in the United States of America took great pride in the fact that we were a republic, and they rejected the European tradition of giving land to the oldest son, primogeniture. And the big legal term for this is called partible inheritance, which means at least among sons, and you women, you have been out of the loop, the land was divided equally. And that was a sign that we truly were a republic. Well, the problem is, if you do that 2, 3, 4 generations, you've got a problem. In my case, I'm a descendant of Nicholas Gibbs, where the Gibbs community is today. He was a German veteran of the American Revolution. He had 1,200 acres, but he had 11 children, 7 sons. By the time my own grandfather, great-grandfather, was born, right before the Civil War, there was no more land to give to the sons. And Lafayette Gibbs, my grandmother's father, went to UT, not because he was interested in books, but because he couldn't make a living farming. And so what happens in East Tennessee, by about the War of 1812, 1815, is the good land's being divided up and it's claimed. So you have intermediate Appalachia. Cades Cove would be a prime example. And what you do is you move from the big valley to the lesser valleys. Well, Cades Cove is a wonderful U-shaped valley with a lot of fertile soil. But it's not very hard scrabble at all. It's actually very prosperous. Doesn't fit your image of Appalachia at all. Okay? That's intermediate Appalachia, and for my book, that's Cades Cove. Then Paul refers to what he calls newest Appalachia, and that's people that kept going further and further back into the hills, what Appalachian scholars call ranch water communities. And just think about it. Now here in the Tennessee Valley, we have this huge bottomland wide valley. Cades Cove, we have these U-shaped coves. But newest Appalachia is V-shaped, no bottomland. So they're going to be poorer to start with than people who are like the founders of Knoxville. Okay? And so geography partly explains the difference. Now, the important thing to keep in mind, and this is a very, very important book for what I'm trying to argue, is that until after the Civil War, the word Appalachia had none of its modern connotation. What's his name? William Blount, John Sevier, none of those people referred to themselves as Appalachians. They were just Americans. Now, this was on the frontier, but there were a lot of frontiers in America, and it was quintessential American, and they never thought of themselves as different. However, we in the Appalachian Studies world have discovered something quite interesting since Shapiro argued it, and I'll come back to Shapiro in a minute. We discovered, and East Tennessee is a poster child for this, that beginning about 1820 through the Civil War, we faced a series of crises here and setbacks. Knoxville less so than the remote areas, but even Knoxville. First of all, the Tennessee River wasn't a good way to market. You had mussel shells down there. Secondly, we divided our land, and a lot of it was, the further you push back, it's hillier land, it's thinner soils, it's rockier soils, and we were facing, before the Civil War, an economic crisis. Nobody was aware of it, any more than you and I were aware a year and a half ago about the economic experience we've had in the last year. Because history sort of sneaks up on us, right? What seems so clear looking in hindsight, when you're living through it's sometimes pretty shocking. Now, we weren't keeping up with the rest of the country, and we were losing our best people. Sam Houston clerked a store in my hometown. Sam Houston was one of the most talented politicians East Tennessee ever produced, but he went to Texas. And literally tens of thousands of Tennesseans went to Texas, and California, and Missouri. That's what Ronald Reagan called voting with your feet. But it caused a crisis for us. It's just like third world countries today, whose best and the brightest come to the United States. Okay? So that is what this book is about. This is actually a book of essays, and it's called Appalachia in the Making. In other words, the stereotype was beginning to develop before the Civil War. Are any of you Civil War buffs? Let me tell you what. I'm sure somebody will challenge me whenever I say this. no part of the United States of America suffered more long-range devastation than East Tennessee. And people would say, well, how can that be? You only had one big battle out here, Fort Sanders, and they fought in 18 minutes. Okay? It doesn't have to do with battles. It has to do with other things. In particular, it has to do with the fact that Lincoln would not allow East Tennessee to stay with the Confederacy. And the Confederacy, we tried, East Tennessee, particularly Greenville, that area, tried to secede, just like West Virginia. We were too strategically located. For that reason, for most of the war, we housed both armies. And they fed themselves by requisitioning hogs and corn from farmers who were already having a tough way to go. And then no part of the country more closely mirrored the Civil War. When the war started, we were 1/3 Yankee, 1/3 rebel, 1/3 leave me alone, I don't want to get involved. When it was over, most of those last guys joined the winners. But when the war was over here on Gay Street, Knoxvillians remembered who fought on one side or the other, and they shot each other down. You know, if we're a violent people, if there's feuding in Appalachia, there's a lot of reasons for it, but it has less to do than a cultural defect and the terrible, terrible effects of a war. That most people don't know this, but I know it as a historian, guys. The American Civil War killed or wounded 1 out of every 17 males in the United States of America. And in East Tennessee, particularly in a place like Cades Cove, where they were very close-knit, it was a much higher percentage. And you don't get over scars like that. And so that's what scholars call Appalachia in the making. Okay? Now, the other key to our dynamism, other than geography and our divisions, other than that, is that we are dynamic, we're not static. And the key to that is how we as East Tennesseans responded to the changes going around us. Now, I would submit to you as a historian, nothing is more basic to history than change. And nothing is more basic in shaping us than how we respond to change. Now, I'm going to throw out a big term for you, but I'm going to give you a simple explanation. Scholars call what I'm talking about selective acculturation. In this room, not all of us respond to this little device here the same way, do we? I would submit to you, and I'll just give you my example as I gave Chris earlier. I use the computer where it helps me do what I want to do better. Writing books, making up tests, averaging students' grades, sending emails, saving 40 cents a day, and checking the baseball scores. My computer guru at web school, I am absolutely sure is very dismayed that I don't use all that other stuff. You didn't notice even the PowerPoint, all I'm doing is making a slideshow out of it. That's selective acculturation. Some people embrace big time. Now, what's that got to do with where we live? I would argue in every society, including East Tennessee and Appalachia, people disagree about how do you embrace electricity? Do you embrace the automobile? That means some people are conservatives, which I tend to think is the default mode of human beings. Let's not change. Or they're liberals. No, change is good. I tend to be liberal, but I think both camps make a really silly mistake. Conservatives assume you can stop change. You can't stop change. Liberals assume all change is good. No, it's not. And even the good changes, progress, brings tremendous human angst as we adjust to a changing world where, for example, religion and family lose their preeminence, and we get all worried about teaching evolution or the decline of the family and family values. Well, anyway, in East Tennessee, people responded to the great changes facing them, particularly after the Civil War, in a variety of ways. The great changes after the Civil War, guys, that's only 140 years ago. That's industrialization, urbanization, modernization. The greatest revolution in American history. It's not the revolution of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. The greatest revolution is the one that culminates in this machine here, and our electricity, our automobile. East Tennesseans responded in a lot of different ways. Now, here, to get away from the philosophical and very practical, the key issue was our regional resources and how would we use them in this new changing America. One set of resources are physical, farmland, which wasn't the best, but was pretty good, particularly in the valley. But as you get up into what I call the hinterlands, it was timber for a place like Cades Cove in the Smokies. And over here in the Clear Fork Valley, it was timber to get to the coal. And how would we use this? And what would we charge? And who would develop it? Every one of those industries required capital, and we didn't have a lot of capital here. So it hooked us up with New York and Philadelphia and places like that. Even London, one of the greatest coal mining companies, was called the American Association, its headquarters in London. That was globalization in the 1890s, folks. The other resource we have is people like you and me, our human resources. First of all, we got to have somebody to cut the trees, farm the land, mine the gold. Why don't we? These people are good at that. Or, as we did earlier with the Cherokee, these people are in the way. So we got to get rid of them. If we got to get rid of them, wouldn't it be nice if we could say, well, they deserve to be gotten? The Cherokee were savage, so send them to Oklahoma. The hillbillies are dumb and ignorant and all those negative things that you said. So let's not lose any sleep. Okay? Now, back to my three communities. Knoxville, in this period of time, became, and it had been the hub of East Tennessee forever. But in this new, much more industrialized, modern America, Knoxville is the economic hub. And so they had a great name, kind of like Higher Ground. Their name was Queen City of the Mountains. They understood that Knoxville's wealth came from timber and coal. You can see it very graphically in the picture here. Knoxville also becomes a cultural hub. You guys that are Vol fans, the University of Tennessee was nothing before the post-Civil War period. It was just a high school associated with First Presbyterian Church, basically, is what it was. It becomes a significant university. Okay? One of the things that's very important to my story, as people have difficult times in the other two communities, Knoxville becomes where people go to move. Because there are jobs down here with the railroad and the factories. And let me just ask you, I can't prove this with the census because the census is asked the wrong question. How many of you know you're a direct descendant of somebody who once was either a farmer, a coal miner, or a lumber person? I will bet you 70% of Knoxvillians today. And if they weren't farmers here, they were farmers. I've got a good friend, a Jewish lady, who says, well, she's not Appalachian, but she's a descendant of a Jewish Russian farmer. And I tell Sheila all the time, if you know Sheila Jacobs, I can give her a hard time. I tell her all the time, she's as Appalachian as I am. Because she's a descendant of somebody who had very similar circumstances. Okay. The Smokies, and Cades Cove is my representative community, but Cades Cove actually got off pretty easy. But the areas beyond. You guys that like Elkmont? This is Elkmont. After Little River Lumber Company got hold of it. When the park became the national park in 1937 is the official opening date, the legislation was 1920. All the areas that we see there along the Little River Road, and much of the national park was clear cut. And so, yeah, there were benefits to this. Those poor hillbillies got jobs. A lot of them got hurt and injured and some killed falling trees. But certainly the environment paid cost. But you got to remember, nobody in America had an environmental ethic in the 1880s. This was a sign of progress, and progress was good. Okay? On the other side, I tell the Webb kids, I'd say the Smokies are our Appalachian backyard. They're over here. If I stand at Webb School, I can point the Smokies out my window. But I take the kids on service outings up Jelly, up in the Clear Fork. Coal mining, I don't know about you guys, I get claustrophobic. You'd have to have a pretty big gun and a pretty big bullet threaten me to get me to go down in the bowels of the earth. But these guys did it. And they did it willingly because it was just like the guys cutting the timber over here at Townsend. It was a paycheck. Farms weren't giving them enough money to enter the consumer economy, and they were all getting Sears and Roebuck catalogs, and their wives wanted gingham dresses and wood stoves, and the guy wanted a new shotgun. So these people are not victims in the sense somebody said, oh, you've got to go in a coal mine. They were glad to do it. But it was a pretty miserable way to make a living. This is the coal camp where I take my kids to work on service outings. And we had about 300 people in a very typical company town. And if you know much about company towns, they're not quite like the Nisqually Hills folks, or even out in Kingston where I live. And so there were benefits and there were costs to this decision to embrace progress and modernity. Now, let's get back to this book. About the time that coal mines are opening up in the Clear Fork and Little River timber companies open up in Townsend, Henry J. Shapiro argues about that very same time the word Appalachia began to take its modern connotation. He blames two groups. One is real close to home to me because he blames missionaries. And I'm a product of Warren Wilson's College, which most of the people over there, it's the most liberal school east of Mississippi, and they don't know this, but Warren Wilson is a descendant of a Presbyterian mission school. Well, how do you convince people to get money to a mission school? You say, well, those hillbillies need your help. They're degraded, they're benighted, they're ignorant. Now, they're good people. We can salvage them. I educate them. Thank God the Presbyterians did that. It gave me a wonderful alma mater. But it also gave Americans an image of a region. Secondly, what Shapiro calls the local color writers. These were the TV journalists of the age. And they only wrote books for one reason, to sell. And what sells? Sex and violence. And so they wrote about incest. And they wrote about feuding. And all these images of Appalachian in a very boring book, I will tell you, but extremely important. I tell web kids, sometimes the most important books are boring. So Shapiro says that by 1900, this image has come along, and I would bring it back to my story. Again, it helps to justify exploitation of labor and damage to the environment. It makes it easier to sleep at night. Progress is a good thing. These people are going to melt right into the melting pot, just like the Indians and the immigrants and all these others. Okay? Now, Shapiro wrote this book at the very beginning of the Appalachian Studies movement, 1979. About 20 years later, a fellow by the name of David Sung, and that is Chinese, so it shows how diverse we are here. This was his dissertation at the University of Michigan. And he qualifies, he doesn't reject this, but he said these outsiders, which we all like, call them foreigners and Yankees and damn Yankees and stuff, he says it wasn't just them. His book is called Two Worlds in the Tennessee Mountains, exploring the origins of Appalachian stereotypes. David says it was people like you and me. People in the cities, not just Knoxville, but Johnson City and places like that. Wanted the railroad to come in, and they wanted to convince the people they had to pay extra taxes, and of course the people up the hills and hollers didn't want it, and so the people in the cities, I call those people, and I lost a lot of sleep over this term, and I finally decided to use it because it applies to my family, so I'm talking fun at myself. I call them successful Appalachians. The people who lived in the geographical region who don't fit the stereotype. Lafayette Gibbs went to college. My grandmother, Nell Thomas, was the first woman graduate of Elizabethton College. Her husband, my grandfather, Tolly Thomas, they were successful. And they, according to David Sung, that kind of people created these stereotypes too. And let me just ask you, nobody has to confess, just listen. How many of you have ever said anything disparaging about somebody else in East Tennessee? Anybody remember Kaz Walker? If you didn't say something disparaging about Kaz, there's something wrong with you. But what happens when the Yankee down there at Purple Beach hears you say something bad about Kaz Walker? And he says, well, I heard this person from Knoxville, she was educated and intelligent, and she said these other people are that way, right? And so, unwittingly, people like myself and my forebears helped to create this image too. Now, the result is my third D. East Tennessee by 1900 is a very divided region. Between the people who fit the stereotype, you can call them the Appalachians, and they're often poor because they work in coal mines and lumber camps and aren't being paid very well. They don't understand the free market economics. The area is often very poor because these are very exploitative environmental, it's extractive industries, folks. Okay? So we're divided. Now, the crisis really comes for East Tennessee after World War I. And you'll have to read my book because I'm going to go real fast. But after World War I, the easiest of the coal and the easiest of the timber was exploited. And so those industries begin to decline. I'll give you an example. Some of my forebears who worked in timber camps over around Andersonville, Tennessee, moved to Eugene, Oregon to work in the timber camps. Okay? Many others are our forebears who come into Knoxville. Okay? But what you've got is that the extractive industries decline. Well, Knoxville is going to decline too, because Knoxville is well dependent on the extractive industry. Now, the real depression for East Tennessee begins about 1920, certainly by 1925. It's not the stock market crash. Knoxville is the last part of East Tennessee to succumb, but Knoxville is knee-deep in trouble long before Black Tuesday. Okay? Then along comes the Depression, and briefly, the divisions diminish because everybody's poor. It's kind of a leveling effect. Now, third Roman numeral on my handout says East Tennessee in the modern era. For my purposes, modernity begins with the Depression, mid-1920s, 1930s. Those of you that are conservative Republicans, just forgive me in advance. Because we East Tennesseans like to talk about how independent and self-reliant and how we don't sponge off the government. By golly, folks, East Tennessee without the federal government would be much more of an armpit than it is. Think about it. TVA, Great Smoky Mountain National Park, Oak Ridge National Labs, UT. Much of UT's budget has always come from federal dollars, research, agricultural investments from the federal government. Now, I would argue if you look at these, for me, TVA, it's real obvious. There's a lot of benefits. My father, Luke Eugene Banker, was 20 years old in 1933 when Norris Dam started. They hired him, and they said, son, we need to hire more people, so if you want to go to UT part-time, you can work a quarter, go to UT a quarter. By the time Dad was done, he had a law degree and a business degree. He started off shoveling mud and running a jackhammer. He ended up pushing a pencil, got hired at Oak Ridge when the Manhattan Project came. A lot of benefits. I live next to the gold ash mill. Cost, too. The most immediate cost in for people would be, this is the Smokies, but Norris Dam, where people were forced off their land. And again, how did TVA justify this? Oh, these are hillbillies, they don't need this land. It's for the good of the whole region. And in fact, it was. We all got electricity, and we got rivers that we can navigate and fish in, and boat and water ski, right? But some people paid the price. Now, when the Great Smoky Mountain National Park came in, we had to get rid of those hillbillies. Now, the irony is the rhetoric, and again, if you're a good friend of David Chapman, who's Knoxville's great promoter of the park, he was very guilty of this. He said, oh, those people aren't really important. They just live in log cabins. They're poor and backwards. Well, guys, that's not a log cabin. And you won't see this building in Kate's Cove today. You'll see log cabins because the only buildings the federal government left were log cabins because that proved their point that these people were primitive. Right? And so even the people who help us out help to perpetuate the stereotype. And if we have a mirror somewhere, we can all look at it, and we're in that picture. I'll guarantee you. I'm guilty. Now, in the case of TVA, and this gets us back to the coalition. Do you know much about TVA's history? It's fascinating now, and I've got an Obama sticker on my arm. Obama is often likened to FDR. The truth be known about TVA, FDR didn't quite know what he wanted. George Norris what he wanted. He was a bleeding heart liberal. Okay? A.E. Morgan, the first director, TVA had 3 directors in those days. He was a bleeding heart liberal. And he saw it as a way of reaching the entire Appalachian region, which is the Tennessee Valley watershed, and particularly reaching out to the poorest people and using sort of the old missionary tactics of teaching people how to farm better, contour plow, etc. But if you know anything about TVA, within a year, the other 2 directors turned on A.E. Morgan. One of the other directors was David Lilienthal, and the other was a man who had been president of UT, H.A. Morgan. They said, nah, that's just idealistic stuff. Let's just build dams, let's build infrastructure. They were, although they were all Democrats, they were the more Republican by today's mindset. Let's not spend money on people, let's spend money on, bricks and mortar. Well, they had a real nasty feud, and two can always beat one. And in 1937, A.E. Morgan's kicked out. And TVA shifted its emphasis primarily to building dams. Okay? And I would argue the people who benefited the most were the people in the valley. The people way up in the hills, they've lost sight. But World War II's on the horizon. We can't worry about those poor people anyway. Now, World War II brings the second great change to TVA. We had to beat the Axis, guys. So we had Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge needs electricity. The dams by 1945 were maxed out. Hydro. TVA made a very fateful decision. Kingston steam plant's one manifestation. We're going to burn coal. And we're going to beat the Russians by 46, 47. It's Cold War, no longer World War II. We're going to beat the Russians, and we're going to let people in Knoxville, and where Banker lives up there in Kingston, have cheap electricity. Now, again, benefits. All of us in this room benefited immensely from that. Growing up near the Kingston steam plant, everybody I knew, first of all, we didn't think we were Appalachian because we were middle class. Because their daddies worked at the steam plant or at the K-12, K-25, Y-12. Okay, we were middle class. Flip the light switch on, never worry where the coal came from. Now, the big losers in this situation were people in places like the Clear Fork Valley. Because TVA said we got to burn cheap coal. Now, not time for a geology lecture. Anybody ever here had anything to do with mining coal? Deep coal, which is what we've gotten for years, is actually, it's the safest coal to mine. Because if you think of, like, if you put a blackboard here, you got a lot of mountain up here to keep it from falling down on you. The closer you get to the surface, the more likely you're going to have a fall on the mine. And so they had gotten, it seems counterintuitive, but it's not. They had gotten the coal that could have been gotten without great danger to people's lives. And so you had this coal near the surface. Well, guess what? Good example of historical timing. World War II gave us explosives. It gave us heavy equipment. What had been Sherman tanks became bulldozers and draglines and scoop shovels. And boy, we all have been happy days America. This is history I lived through right now. So let's just blow up those mountains. Now, growing up in East Tennessee, I never heard of strip mining until the 60s. And I think my first recollection of strip mining is when I-75 was built. And that goes back to higher ground. Because the old roads, think about it, 25, 27 were down below. But when 75 was opened, I heard people say, what are they doing up there? And so, but in the meantime, a place like the Clear Fork Valley, guys, it did bring money in, there's no doubt about it. But TVA paid the lowest possible rate. And whereas deep mining, particularly before mechanization, is highly labor intensive and produces lots of jobs, strip mining is capital intensive. And a man with a couple $1,000, big trucks and dynamite and bulldozers can hire 2 other men. So the economic benefit of strip mine coal is minimal, the environmental effect, and the long-range economic cost to a region that's devastated. That's why in the 60s, all of us in this room remember Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, right? That's where those pictures came from. I remember looking at them and asking my mother, and she said, oh, that's not us. But I didn't know that the Kingston Steam Plant coal came from right out of that situation. Okay. This is an early strip mine. This is a recent strip mine. Real quickly, in 1977, one of the men I greatly admired, who's always gets me a lot of jokes from my Republican friends at Webb School, is Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter said, we got a lot of coal, but we're not going to keep blowing up mountains. And so he pushed for a law that locally is called SMACRAC. It stands for Surface Mining Reclamation Act. And it was a compromise, just like Obama's going to have to compromise on health care or whatever. So it's not perfect, but it was the first serious attempt to deal with this issue. What has happened since SMACRAC has passed is coal companies, and I don't think they're demons. I have some wonderful friends who tour my kids and show them strip mining sites and talk about reclamation of them. But what they've come up with is ways, this is mountaintop removal, and you don't have to follow the rules of SMACRAC because you've got technology that it allows you to find the loophole, just like taxes, loophole. Okay? And so our air conditioning, our electricity right here is coming from this kind of coal. And what I tell the web kids, after they go up on top, and we've been on this Zeb Mountain, which is between here and Huntsville. After we come down, they're all kind of aghast. These are the kids that, at the beginning of school, wanted the air conditioner at 58 degrees and the window wide open at the same time. I said, guys, if you just tell me you've taken shorter showers the rest of the semester, you get an automatic C. You don't have to do any work. I'll give you a C for just taking a shorter shower. Now, what about the rest of East Tennessee? Well, in the Cades Cove area, when the park came, the timber industry pretty well played out. But thanks to our wonderful mountains that healed themselves very quickly, tourism came along. Some of you remember this. You can tell by the models of the cars. They're still in business. They're just engulfed by the Red Roof Inn or Red Roof Malls and all today. But this is when Pigeon Forge was in the middle of nowhere. Well, tourism is a kind of extractive industry too. It's not as extreme as strip mining. I call it, when I go to Pigeon Forge, I call it strip mining soul. Particularly when you have to sell who you are to somebody who's just like the Cherokee Indians who dress up like they're Sioux Indians because the tourists expect them to do that. When we hillbillies begin to talk about food and moonshine and playing jam clap for the tourist, there's a cost. At least in my opinion there is. Okay, and so you have Pigeon Forge and you have Gatlinburg. Benefits, and I think, for example, I think Dolly is a wonderful woman. She's done wonderful for that community. But there's cost for that, all that asphalt and all that wonderful farmland that's no longer there. The cost of losing your image, your sense of self. I don't have pictures, so use your imagination. Imagine being in a Pigeon Forge traffic jam. There's a cost. Imagine being in a Cades Cove Loop Road traffic jam. There's a cost. Imagine the Smokies that are really Smokies today because of acid rain. There's a cost. There's nothing new. All human history is benefit and cost, benefit and cost. The question is, whose values are we basing our decisions on? And I would argue, as an American historian, Americans have rarely asked that question because we've had so much abundance. But it's not going to happen in the 21st century. We've got to ask, is the benefit worth the cost? Is it consistent with my values as a Republican, a Democrat, a Christian, a Catholic, a Jew, a Presbyterian? We got to ask those questions. Now, what about Knoxville? Knoxville, and I would argue Kingston, where I lived. I'm not quite as up to snuff as you Knoxville people, but we weren't Appalachian. We were middle class. We benefited the most from all these changes. Knoxville's wealth 100 years ago was based on coal and timber. Knoxville's wealth in the 20th century is primarily based on its ability as a hub for farm products and raw materials. Most of us Knoxvillians are descendants of people who came in, and most of us have done well. Well, what have we lost? There's been some cost. We've, I believe, lost our identity of who we are. We've bought into somebody else's idea of Appalachian and said, oh, no, we're not. Okay? We very much, Knoxville, and I really respect Jimmy Duncan. Successful politicians in East Tennessee have to talk the rhetoric of being, oh, we're independent, descendants of pioneers, and then give me all that federal money. Howard Baker's done it, Lamar Alexander's done it, the Duncans have done it. That's what you got to do to be successful in East Tennessee. And I'm not saying those guys are bad. They're very smart politically. But they don't let me sell that second part. But it's true. Okay? Now, in a longer range, though, Knoxville pays cost. Charlie Daniels, one of my favorite friends in all the world. Have you ever heard Charlie talk? He tells web kids, he says, well, I was dyslexic. And said, that's why I'm a great cartoonist. Because it makes you creative. And I think he's right. You see the world differently. Charlie, and he couldn't tell me what the date was for this cartoon, but this was obviously pre-coal ash spill. And his point is that the national park pays a huge price when we burn coal down in Kingston or in Rogersville or wherever. Well, guess what, guys? Knoxville until last year had the highest asthma rate in the United States of America. I've lost one web alumnus, a wonderful girl. She died at 25 years of age. We pay a price. We get the electricity. We don't pay the cost that the people up there where they're blowing up mountains. But if you think you don't pay a price, you haven't been looking at your doctor bills. I used to tease the web kids when they remember the Pigeon River controversy. I said, you know what? I said, we're all downriver from Champion Paper Company. Not just the people up in the hills, but the people in Hawaii Hills, the Tennessee River, you know, the tributaries to Pigeon. In the 21st century, we can't escape these realities. Now, at the same time all this was going on, we're back to the 1960s. And this great cultural upheaval, civil rights, counterculture, Vietnam War, what I call anti-modernism, which is the most interesting twist of all of this sort of liberal angst, is the rejection of the myth of progress. And my classmates, all that weren't hippies, were at least very simple in their attire and their fashion, because we were rejecting progress and modernity. Now, it was out of that ferment that Appalachian Studies, as a discipline, as a way of, as a higher ground of viewing the world, emerged. Okay? Now, gradually, this intellectual movement, all of them collectively, Appalachian Studies being the most important for my purposes here, has revealed our interdependence with the bigger world. If there's poverty in Clear Fork Valley, it has something to do with the fact that there's a lot of rich people in Pittsburgh that made money off the steel industry. If there's poverty in parts of the Smokies, it's partly because timbering and tourism pay more money to the outside investors than it did to the people who cut down the trees or now work in the restaurants and the maids in the hotels. And we're just talking about the nature of capitalism, and I don't believe in evil conspiracies to take over the world. It's just the nature. Okay? And I'm not calling for any revolution and overthrowing capitalism. It brings lots of benefits. It also comes with cost. Are we aware of the cost? Okay? Now, nowhere is our intertwined diversity more evident, though, in the story of coal. Coal brings benefits to the people up in the Clear Fork. It brings, a few of them, brings jobs. For we in Kingston and Knoxville and all the people who get TV electricity, it brings us electricity. But coal comes with cost. I'm very lucky in the sense that the coal ash spill occurred when it did. Go back and tell you just a little bit about my book. I turned in, it was 500 pages last August, and I expected it to be copy edited by October and out by March. Well, UT Press got caught in the economic slowdown. So the copy editor didn't look at my book until February. The coal ash spill occurred. I immediately said, I'm rewriting the epilogue. Because as Charlie picked up here, guys, the coal ash spill illustrates my thesis that we're all Appalachian. Satan calls this the cold day in hell. He says it's TVA. They want to know how we handle our ash. Now, my neighbors and I are very much affected. I own 22 acres on Watts Bar Lake. It's what's left of the family farm. If I'm going to retire from teaching before I'm 67, I have to liquidate some land. My land was really, really pricey about 5 years ago. The tax assessor in Roane County says, well, right now our zip code is toxic. You know, people up in Michigan who are going to sell and buy on the Tennessee market aren't buying. They won't even look. I have a lot of confidence that the economy will turn around and we'll get over this and I'll be able to retire, and it won't come from the royalties on the book. It will come from selling some acres. But we're all affected. And you're affected too, folks, because you're TVA ratepayers. And make it even worse and show you how we are, to use an Appalachian term, incestuously intertwined. I could get a payoff from TVA for the damage they've done to the value of my property, but have to pay for it in my monthly bill. And you all are going to join me in paying it out. So we're all intertwined. Okay? That's the other end, the coal ash spill, right there. That's two sides of the coal equation. Now, I'm going to wrap it up, folks. You all have heard enough from me. Where does this leave us? I'm going to give you a view from higher ground from an unapologetically biased perspective. I tell web kids all the time, the word bias gets a bad rap. Anybody that's purely objective is purely worthless. But you ought to know what your biases are. You ought to know where they come from and how they fit with your values. And I tell the kids, they're a lot younger than you and I are, that's their biggest challenge. They're 17 years of age. I said, by the time you're 25, you ought to see if you've gotten this cost-benefit analysis that's consistent with your values. And if you have biases that aren't worthy of your identification, you ought to get rid of it. And if you think Dr. Banker taught you a bias that's not worthy, then you ought to get rid of it. But you ought to at least know where you're coming from. So here are a couple of thoughts. Obviously, as a historian, I think we don't know our history very well. And we do need to know our past. And we need to be honest about our past. No one in this region, though, is this more true for than those of us who've been the winners most of the time. The successful Appalachians, the Knoxville, the people like myself who've grown up middle class, upper class, and benefited in ways that we just kind of thought, well, we were better. No, there's a history behind it, and it's mostly good luck. We need to know that. Now, I said I had a second 3Ds. My second 3Ds applies to people like myself. And I came up with this trying to struggle to understand my grandparents and my great-grandparents, whose history I knew about. They represented, I represent, you folks represent successful Appalachians. And we've committed 3 sins. One, when people said, "Are you Appalachian?" we said, "No, we're not." Which is true. We're not, in a cultural sense. I call it denial. Secondly, though, that wasn't good enough. Then we had to disassociate. We had to say, "Oh, I'm not, but he is." There's a guy talking about a speck in your brother's eye and a beam in your own. I think he was pretty smart. That's a disassociation from the group that we don't belong to. Is understandable. Unfortunately, though, the third D is denigration. To prove we don't fit with the group that we disassociate from, we say, "Well, I'm not a hillbilly. You want to see a real hillbilly? Go out there where Banker is." And you point to somebody else. Now, this is real simple. It's complex, but it's real simple. If you belong to a group that you don't fit the popular image of, and you remove yourself from it, who is left to define that group? Let's say none of us are rural and poor and ignorant. So we say, "I'm not Appalachian." Who is left to define Appalachian?
A Yankee.
No. Who is left that resides here to say who we are? It is someone who's poor, it is someone who's ignorant, and someone who's rural. And you've got a cycle going. You can only break the cycle if we say, we're tired of the Yankees and other people saying who we are. You break the cycle when you say, your image of Appalachia has brought great harm to me personally because I've lost my sense of identity. I call that cultural ballast. I don't think anybody needs roots in today's world. The world changes way too rapidly. But you need ballast. Ballast keeps a boat even. Ballast is not some fairy tale nostalgic view of our history. That's my problem with the Heartland series and the Appalachian Museum. That will not serve us because it's not honest. It's rooted in truth, but it's not the whole story. Not that I see with 2020 vision, folks. But we need an honest accounting of how we got where we are. As long as the people in the region who have benefited the most from the way we got where we are don't do that, this cycle is self-perpetuating. The question I asked the web kids, are you going to break the cycle? I'll ask you this now. Thank you for listening.